Hey, what's up everybody? My name is Onepeg. In this video, there is an article that was written back on the 11th of September. Unfortunately, I missed that the YouTuber Kira ended up doing a bit of a take on. I have a slightly different opinion on what this article is outlining. There's a couple of things in here that I feel as though I'm a little bit better suited at in terms of like level of understanding, might have a little bit of a different opinion, but I want to go through it because, I mean, we've covered every step of the way of this legal battle right along, so might as well do it again. Anyway, the website This Is Game ended up putting out an article regarding the trial, saying that Nexon versus Ironmace, the 3 issues of the verdict of the century. Now, I don't know if it's actually considered the verdict of the century, but I do believe it's an important verdict because of what's kind of been going on. See, Nexon decided that they were going to sue Ironmace because 11 or so key members of the Ironmace team that at one time worked for Nexon on a project called P3, and prior to that, there were people in that team that worked on a project called LF that I'll get into in a minute, ultimately decided that they were going to leave Nexon, led by Ju-Hoon Choi and Terry Sangwa Park. Now, Terry Sangwa Park is Terrence, Ju-Hoon Choi is SDF. Now, those people, when they left, started Ironmace, and once they started Ironmace, about a year after they began Ironmace games, we had our first playable, I guess, demo, pre-alpha, like, weekend, if you want to put it that way, to review Dark and Darker. Now, when they got to about the 3rd or so playtest, when the game hit about 106,000 concurrent players on Steam, Nexon filed a lawsuit and a DMCA takedown request with Steam to take the game off of Steam. Then we ended up having a couple of playtests that were done through BitTorrent for playtests 4 and 5, ultimately having Dark and Darker release their game themselves on their own platform called Blacksmith, and through a Korean gaming site that operated kind of like a gaming marketplace that they don't work with anymore, ultimately getting the case dismissed in American court and then having the DMCA vacated from Steam when the Nexon court refused to allow Nexon to place an injunction while this court case was going on. Basically, Nexon tried to stifle Ironmace from being able to continue working on the project until this court case got figured out, and that didn't work. More or less, the court told Nexon and Ironmace that neither one of them could continue like bullying each other while this thing got figured out. Ironmace wanted Nexon to stop trying to file DMCA requests, and Nexon wanted Ironmace to just close their doors and stop working because they say that the project was stolen. Now, whether or not it was actually stolen, we don't know. That's what it comes down to the court for. In the United States, it was being litigated at the same time, and the United States kicked it out of U.S. court because this was being litigated in Korea at the same time, and the U.S. more or less said that the United States was not the most convenient forum, not the most convenient place to have this heard, and it was kicked out to South Korea due to what is called forum non-convenience, or non-convenient forum. Makes sense. So now it is being litigated in Korea. And according to this article, there is a sentencing, or the verdict will be read October 24th at 2 p.m. Korea time. Now that works out to be about midnight or so Eastern Standard Time. So we should end up having an article written by Kim Jae-suk, who's the person that's been following this for every article that's been written. There should be an article written by him at some point, at the point in time, I guess, I roll out of bed. I would assume that they would have something out by then. Now, if they don't, I know it'll be the next day, but either way, I'll probably end up reading whatever it is that they end up saying. Point being, if you end up enjoying this stuff, maybe consider subbing the channel, because we do this kind of stuff all the time, and more as time goes on, I seem to be getting into more investigative journalism than less. So yeah, maybe sub the channel. That would be pretty sweet. Anyway, on to the article. So they say that the civil suit was filed in April of last year against Ju-Hoon Choi and Terrence Sangwa Park and Ironmace Games, saying that more or less Ju-Hoon Choi stole all of this IP from Nexon. Now, there's an awful lot for this kind of stuff, and we have to go back in time a whole lot of different videos, and I'm going to spare you from all of that. What I want to do is, once the verdict is read, maybe just before, we'll end up doing a full history on everything that had happened, key points that were made, and whatnot. This article goes into 3 main points. The first one being, are there substantial similarities between the 2 games? The second did Joo-Hoon Choi reach out to external investors to try to get them to invest into his game versus that of Project P3? And the third one, did Joo-Hoon Choi actually steal source code? Now, it seems as though there's no actual answer for any of these 3 points. There's just a lot of allegations, and some of this stuff has some holes that you can punch in it. So in the article, the first thing that they want to talk about is substantial similarities. Basically, is the game Ironmace made so similar to Project P3 that there's no way that one could exist without the other, to the extent that it was more or less taken. The plaintiff's claim is that Nexon invested in the development of LF, which then turned into Project P3. LF is the, I guess, code name for the project that P3 became, that was single player in design, and they decided that it wasn't good enough, so then they moved on to Project P3. P3 being something that was designed more around a multiplayer feel. Now, Nexon's legal representative Kim Ann Chang alleged that Ironmace stole the core game elements and mechanics of Project P3 that was being developed on Mint Rocket, which is a fully owned subsidiary of Nexon that Nexon created to, I guess, appear more of an indie studio and get away from the Nexon name so that it wasn't synonymous with Nexon in the Western market. The idea being that a lot of Nexon games are reviewed or viewed by the Western market as pay to win or heavily laden with microtransactions, and they are, versus what Mint Rocket was creating, which was something that is more palatable. Because we recognize the name Mint Rocket, we don't suddenly go, ew, Nexon, right? So that's why Mint Rocket more or less exists. Also, laughable moment when Dave the Diver got put up for a game award as best indie game of the year when they're backed by a $30 billion company, but I digress. Nexon cited specific gameplay, character classes, and similarities, the way they interact as examples. The lawyer briefly played LF, P3, and Dark and Darker, and pointed out that LF, which was a single-player PvE game, developed into P3 through the R&D process with Nexon. To summarize the plaintiff's claims, LF was made by 13 developers. It wasn't a multiplayer game, it was a single-player game, and took about 8 months of development. During the midterm evaluation process, he explained, from the company's point of view, this is not enough fun, so they gave us the company's input to make it more interesting, and so many people started to brainstorm and make P3. Nexon's claim is that the leader, Joo-Hoon Choi, took this P3 out and then made Dark and Darker. Now, here is the interesting thing, because the court actually ordered these guys to provide video evidence. The court ordered the two companies to perform the video PT, saying the key part is the similarity or non-similarity of the works of the two parties. The creativity part in the selection and arrangement of the game components seems to be the key content, so it can only be seen clearly when you actually play the video in person. In response, Nexon and Ironmace argued in court through PT. So here's the interesting thing, is Nexon came to court showing screenshots of the game side by side, which are probably the screenshots that we've seen publicly. And whether or not they actually had a playable demo or if there were actual side-by-side video comparisons, we don't really know, because again, this article is being written in Korean and it's being translated into English by Google Translate. So there's going to be some context clues and whatnot that aren't all the way accurate, but what it sounds like is Nexon showed screenshots of Project P3 and then said, in Dark and Darker, all the elements that were in P3 were used as they were, meaning P3 and Dark and Darker use the exact same stuff, including the tavern, colors, the color scheme, concepts, opening of lock boxes, the animations, and doors. The defendant has presented a number of preceding games to deny the originality of P3, and none of them are similar in original components and organic combinations to P3, he said. Now, if I may, we'll start talking about arrangement here. Now, it's not just that the game starts in a tavern, or just that the certain door animations are what they are, or just that the opening of treasure chests, and lockboxes are what they are. What they are talking about is how they are all arranged together. Like, if you were to take a series of musical notes, 3 or 4 of them in a row might not necessarily make a song copyright infringement. But if you start taking entire parts and arranging them in the exact same order, then the argument is, well, maybe that is actually taking something from something that came before. And the idea being that who should have ownership over this stuff? Should Nexon have ownership or some ownership over this? Does Ironmace owe Nexon a portion of their income? Does Ironmace owe the entire thing? Does Nexon get to own Ironmace or the IP and decide then what happens to it? Those are the questions that are trying to get answered here. So whether or not this actually infringes on copyright, again, is what the court is trying to decide. Dark and Darker starts in a tavern. Now, that by itself is the beginning of every D&D campaign that has ever existed, at least the stereotypical ones, where everyone always starts in a tavern. And that was the idea behind both, likely, these projects, is a Dungeons and Dragons inspired dungeon crawler. So the idea of a game starting in a tavern as inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, to me, by itself, is not enough to warrant a copyright claim. Nexon explained that the concept of the tavern also existed from the planning stage of P3, again, because it existed with Dungeons & Dragons. The intention of P3 was to get better items by going down, or to escape because you might not survive. He said, claiming that this intention was also taken by Dark and Darker. So the idea of going into further and further floors or leaving, again, I don't believe is a unique concept here, nor is the idea of starting in a tavern and then deciding later on if you're going to retreat or not a unique concept. There were Sega Genesis games that existed in the past that did this. Nexon says that the Barbarian class has the function of breaking doors, which is also implemented in Dark and Darker. There is a casting animation when opening a box, and the same animation is included in Dark and Darker. Light and darkness are set as important elements of the game, so that the mechanism of lighting up dark spaces with torches and not being able to see the opponent in the dark is included in the same way. Even if you purchase the assets, the fact that the size of the door asset was increased by 1.4x was said to be copyright infringement. So what they're trying to say is that certain sizes of assets are identical or nearly identical, or a lot of the assets that were arranged in the way that they were arranged in were nearly identical. And Nexon provides this screen cap to the court. They provided this screen cap. We saw this in their original filing documents. In addition, Nexon said P3 is not a game that has been completely developed and released, but has been temporarily suspended due to the defendant's illegal acts. The mere fact that it has been discontinued is enough to warrant an admission of copyright infringement. So there's a little bit of back and forth with this. Nexon claims that the game was temporarily suspended because the defendants quit. The defendants have always claimed that they quit because Nexon suspended the project. Like it was something that they had wanted to continue to work on, but among other reasons, Nexon suspended the project because of frustrations or whatever, and Joo-Hoon Choi decided that he was going to quit and pursue something else because he didn't want to have to deal with the bureaucracy anymore. Now, whether or not, again, there's a legal precedent or something in here that the Korean courts would be able to lean on to say yes or no, this is illegal or you can't do that, is yet to be seen. We don't really know. Defendant's argument. Now we're on to the defense's side. This is what Ironmace had to say. Regarding the substantial similarity between P3 and Dark and Darker, Ironmace's legal representative, Lin, defended that Dark and Darker created the game through personal embodied knowledge in prior games. Now, I want to say that I watched Kira's video on this, and at this point, he had a little bit of a chuckle saying that, well, that's because it was stolen.
And prior games. Personally embodied knowledge. Yeah, personally embodied because you worked on the game at Nexon for a while beforehand.
Now, again, this hasn't been proven to have been stolen at all. He also, in the video that I watched, Kira ended up making the mention that he wasn't sure of any prior IP that existed that somebody would have been inspired by this. But I want to go through the remainder of this and I'll show you. Regarding Nexon's influence of the pivot from LF to P3, I don't know what other people at Nexon contributed to anything, but the main ideas and elements were planned by Joo-Hoon Choi at the time and is confirmed through objective evidence. And of course, it's difficult to say that everything was created by the team leader from the beginning to end, but the bold things that are at the core of the ideas and the overall direction were created by team leader Choi. Now, if somebody takes an idea and puts it to paper or puts it on a PC and starts coding their way through that idea at Nexon or at a different company, whatever is on that PC or whatever is had by Nexon, that IP is Nexon's. But there is a gray area when it comes to legality in the US. I don't know how it is in Korea necessarily, but there's a gray area when it comes to ideas in someone's head and them taking those ideas with them outside. The Bratz dolls are a perfect example of this, where someone had come up with the idea of Bratz while working for Barbie and then left to pursue the idea of Bratz after quitting Barbie. Barbie ended up suing Mattel, I think is who owned it, sued the Bratz dolls and lost in court. Strangely enough, they were represented by the same lawyer that represented Ironmace in the United States. Bratz was on the opposite side of that one. Mattel was actually represented by Ironmace's lawyer in the US. But they lost. Barbie lost because Bratz, even though the idea had come up with while at Barbie, and there were even rough sketches that Barbie ended up trying to reference even though that was done around the time that they were still employed by Barbie, the Bratz dolls were found victorious. They were allowed to continue doing what they were doing, and Barbie had no claim to it. Now, again, Korean court is different. There are other things, like PricewaterhouseCoopers employed someone that had a piece of software that they took with them to Japan, and someone in Japan got a hold of that software and decided to iterate on it. They built something on top of the original accounting software that PwC had. The people at PwC sued the Japanese company because that new piece of software was built off of the prior one. PricewaterhouseCoopers lost because iterations of prior IP are not necessarily copyrighted works. So the question then becomes, if P3 was never actually published and the idea of P3 was in Joo-Hoon Choi's head, assuming that he hadn't actually stolen source code and all those other things, are they still held to the same standard for copyright? Because if he's just iterating on an idea that he had while he was still working for P3, it may be that the court finds that Joo-Hoon Choi didn't actually violate any laws. It's a big gray area here. Now, one could absolutely have inspired the other, or the inspiration could have come from a separate place. And again, I'll show you what I mean. Ironmace went on to introduce a comment from an American user who said the reason why the two games are similar is because this genre has been made for a long time. Now, again, when I watched Kira's video, he ended up having a little bit of a chuckle here, and he tried to say that he's not sure what American would have said such a thing, but he probably doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm pretty sure that the American that they're referencing is me, and I'll show you what I was talking about.
Before Dark and Darker came out, which game looked like and played like Dark and Darker? Because I don't think there was one.
This is a YouTube video made by my homie Stouty, and I'll put a link in the description for you guys that end up wanting to see it, but it's just a couple of minutes long. This game looks awful similar to Dark and Darker, wouldn't you say? Well, this is a Chivalry 1 mod called Random Dungeon. It has been around for a very long time. It has skeletons, it has chest opening animations, there's tons of different loot and things that you can grab. It has levels. It has random monster spawns. There are rooms in this game. There's turning on and off of torches. There are rooms in this game. Now, granted, they've got Quake 3 Arena POV, don't get me wrong, but there are rooms in this game that look very similar to how Dark and Darker works. Very similar. It's a little bit older. It's a little bit different in scope and vision, but it's an extraction game that existed back in the day as a mod for Shiv. So when I say that this has existed for a very long time, I mean to the extent that the devs for Dark and Darker must have played that mod for Chivalry 1. They had to have, because that's the only place that this likely came from, other than the head of Joo-Hoon Choi, was it was inspired by a free mod that anyone can download, could download even right now, and play Random Dungeon right now. In addition, he argued that P3 is a battle royale game with a magnetic field limit, but Dark and Darker has a time limit and escape is possible according to the player's choice. In addition, he said P3 could change between first and third person, but Dark and Darker is basically a first person game following the traditional FPS. Now, they're talking about differentiators here. The idea being that you could move the camera between first and third person in Project P3, but Dark and Darker is only a first-person camera, and that's it, which I actually prefer. I don't like slashers like this being something where you can go third person. I think it offers a little bit too much of an advantage, and depth perception gets all kinds of messed up. In addition, P3 can use fireballs in the spellbook. What they mean is the spellbook itself. If you hold the spellbook, there was a set of spell charges that were built into the spellbook. But the magic of Dark and Darker is bound to the character, meaning each character class has its own built-in spells and magic. It wasn't based on whatever weapon you were holding. Now, the interesting thing with that is that Dungeonborn is kind of sort of the opposite. It's a bit of a hybrid. You had skills that you would use, 2 of them, and then in addition to that, based on the weapon you were holding, there were certain attacks that you would get based on whether or not you held a mouse button, left click, right click, that kind of thing. While P3 only had 8 weapons, Dark and Darker had 74 weapons and unique attack motions. The defendant's position was that there were no respawn shop systems or landmarks in P3 that hindered attacks. So they were talking that if you swung a weapon and collided with a wall, it just swung through. We actually saw that in earlier editions of Dungeonborn and Greed is Good. In Dark and Darker, there were collision with the environment, something that I think set the game apart. And there was collision with shields and whatnot too. The defense's position saying that there weren't any of these additional elements is, again, the question of whether or not the court is going to look at them building upon the idea of P3, because P3 coming before shows is a predecessor, but the idea of P3 being what it is that something that Dark and Darker has iterated on enough to where P3 isn't really something that Nexon could lay claim on it. And again, we don't know the answer to that, but needless to say, there is still stuff here that makes you kind of scratch your head a little bit. The defense attorney also argued that P3 had no protected value interest under the law. There's a number of features that are not found in P3, and although the idea is common, P3 is not a released game, so it is necessary to determine whether the alleged infringement is worth protecting. Concepts such as dungeon escape and dark fantasy are public realms that can be used by anyone, and director Joo-Hun Choi combined these ideas to create a new game, Dark and Darker. Among the PTs, the defendant showed Sudden Attack and Counter-Strike, Kart Rider, and Mario Kart side by side, because Nexon has developed games that are eerily similar to Counter-Strike, meaning Sudden Attack, which was Counter-Strike's ripoff, and Kart Rider, which is a Mario Kart ripoff, have yet to have any type of court proceedings for copyright infringement, although Sudden Attack, I think, turned into like Nexon's version of Counter-Strike and was licensed from Valve, likely because Valve was looking to sue them. Because Nexon adopted a system similar to Valve's and Nintendo's previous games, according to the plaintiff's claims, Nexon has committed multiple copyright infringements. If we judged items such as copyright infringement based only on the simple resemblance of the atmosphere of the stills, there's virtually no game that doesn't infringe on the rights of the preceding game. Now, again, this is what I was talking about. They're only showing screenshots. If they're showing fully playable demos, if P3 was something that was fully playable, they bring it to court and go like, here you go, here's your controller, run around, and then compare it to Dark and Darker, here you go, run around. If that's something that was being done, then I think that would be a much easier time. But Nexon and P3, from all accounts in this article, doesn't look as though those demos are playable from Nexon's side. If they're not playable, if it's not something they can put a controller to and actually run around and show people this is what the game looks like, how are you going to just go off of screenshots? I mean, yeah, there's concepts and all of the other things, but to say that the animations are the same without actually showing the animations, it's going to be kind of a tough sell, I think. Was the source code from Nexon stolen? Now, the story with this is that Joo-Hun Choi, who was employed by Ironmace back in 2020 during COVID, was trying to work from home because of all the lockdown stuff. He set up a server at his house, and Nexon allowed him to use that server to send files back and forth so that he continued working on the game, being productive, trying to make deadlines. Makes sense. Now, knowing SDF the way that I know him now, what I can say is he's the type of person that will stay up and work for 30 plus hours at a stretch. He doesn't sleep, and he just kind of grinds. That's just the person that he is. So it's very likely at different points in time, this was how he was operating when it came to this Nexon project. Now, at some point in time, he was supposed to have requested to have like his license, the permission slip or whatever, to be able to continue using this server at his house. He was supposed to like ask if he could continue to do that at one point in time, and then just kind of didn't. Likely because he was working overnight trying to make deadlines, and these types of things slip your mind. I'm ADHD as hell. I can only tell you how many times I have forgotten to meet a date. My gosh. But in his case, the person, like the security officer or whatever, kind of caught on, told them that they were supposed to be using a different repository to send these files back and forth and log in remotely and whatnot. And while he had agreed that he would do that, he kind of just didn't. Likely because, again, being on deadlines and being pushed to have to finish things by a certain point in time, you kind of end up going with what works, and you don't ever get around to setting up the thing you were supposed to do. People in corporate America do this kind of shit all the time. They skirt, they cheat, they cut corners. It just is what it is. Now, whether or not that's something he should have been doing is irrelevant. Like, he shouldn't have been doing that, especially after they told him that he wasn't supposed to be. And there was a disciplinary action that ended up occurring as a result from this once they found out that he was still doing this stuff. When they called him into the office, he was probably disgruntled or whatever. It seems like at that point in time, he had been arguing back and forth with his superiors and probably told them to go pound salt and said, fuck it, I quit. Now, whether or not that actually happened, I don't know, but I could absolutely see a scenario in which that has occurred. It's no secret at this point that Joo-Hun Choi and his superiors were kind of bumping heads at that point in time. Now, again, him acting out of spite or acting out of anger or whatever, fine. Not necessarily the best business move, but sometimes people get emotional and they do stupid shit. It is what it is. From there, though, there's the question of what he did afterward, and that's where the source code question comes into play. At the point in time of this disciplinary action, he was also told to sign a document that basically said that if he ever left the company, he would surrender any and all IP back to the mothership or delete it. Now, in that document, it actually says in plain English that he is to destroy any information that is Nexon's property. And he signed that document and agreed to it. When he was terminated, they had him come into the office, or when he left, whatever. Again, whoever story you believe, because according to him, he quit, and according to Nexon, he was fired, but whatever. Depending on whose story you believe, he had to sign a document regardless, saying that he would bring in the files that he had on his server and allow Nexon to review them. But remember, at some point in time prior to this, he said that he would also destroy them. Which one do you then go with? Who knows? But then he called them after he left and said, nah, I'm not going to do that. I've deleted everything. So that's what he said that he did. Whether or not that is actually true, we don't know. I don't even know if at this point Nexon and Ironmace have both shown their source code to the court, because they're just talking about how the source code being used and circumstances being what they are, he probably stole it. It says if this source code was used as it is, there would be room for illegality, so it would be another issue other than substantial similarity. Nexon argued that it was necessary to verify the source code was used to create Dark and Darker, saying, if necessary, you can submit the GitHub data extraction process as a video reference, and Ironmace counted Dark and Darker came from the idea of then team leader Ju Huynh Choi, which again goes back to the whole argument of our ideas copyrightable. The tribunal demanded that the source code be uploaded by then team leader Choi on June 30th, be prepared and submitted in the relevance of the current Dark and Darker build. So, Dark and Darker provided source code. I'm going to assume that Nexon also provided their source code so that there could be a direct comparison. Now, according to Ironmace, from the beginning, they have said that their Git logs and the source code of all of the iterative changes going back to the day that Ironmace began and they began coding right off the rip was always available. So the question is whether or not the source code of Ironmace's game is the same as Nexon's. Personally, I think that if Terry Park, who is the CEO of Ironmace, would make a statement that bold, it is believable that they don't have the same source code. And again, it comes down to whether or not ideas are copyrightable then. We don't know. We'll find out in October. Did director Ju Huynh Choi contact external investors as a member of Nexon? The plaintiff's lawyer alleged that Ju Huynh Choi was in constant contact with outside investors during the project and coaxed his team members to go outside and make games. Now again, context being what it is, it's possible that what they meant was they coaxed his team members to leave Ironmace to make games. The defendant said P3 is a project dropped by the plaintiff, and LF was also dropped on the grounds that it was not marketable. Even when he joined P3, he did not lead the project under the leadership of then Vice President Kim Dae-hoon, so he was disciplinarily fired on the basis of Ju Huynh Choi's external server for work. So what they're trying to say, I think, is that Vice President Kim Dae-hoon was trying to tell Ju Huynh Choi that he had to do things a certain way, and Ju Huynh Choi wasn't listening. The defendant alleged that despite the court's order to submit documents against Vice President Kim Dae-hoon, he has never submitted the transcript of his disciplinary committee. So according to Ironmace, this disciplinary committee and its findings were never actually submitted to the court. There weren't any documents submitted. However, in a briefing after the trial, the plaintiff countered that he had submitted all documents requested by the court, saying at the time, President Kim Dae-hoon said that he would take responsibility for the incident because it was under his own management, so he took some responsibility and submitted the documents related to the court. It's only Ju Huynh Choi who has been disciplined for this incident. Kim has now left Nexon to found a game development startup. Immediately after the trial, Nexon said, "We've taken the lawsuit very seriously, considering this case to be a serious issue that undermines the ecosystem of all content industries based on creation and healthy culture of competition. We hope that the acts of trade secret infringement, copyright infringement, and theft of results against P3 will be properly prosecuted and appropriate judgments will be rendered to ensure that such misconduct is not repeated again and that fair competition environments are guaranteed. Ironmace expects that Ironmace will win the case legally and said that it will appeal even if it loses." So that's more or less the entire article. The idea here, again, seems to be centralized around ideas. Now, assuming that Ironmace didn't steal source code or that Ju Huynh Choi didn't take source code, the question of the 1,000 files or whatever that Ironmace is being accused of having striking similarity to and file name and whatnot, being mainly comprised of off-the-shelf assets from the Unreal Asset Store or being core files that are used in Unreal, is a question of arrangement then. Now, it could be that the models that are being used by Ironmace that were also at one time used by Nexon were not that lengthy in name. It's likely that they went to the Unreal Asset Store and figured out what assets they were going to use based on the quality of them and determined that certain asset libraries were the best possible ones to use. The zombie one, or hell, the ogre one, the troll one that is being used in Dark and Darker is the same trolls that you can find being utilized in Mortal Online 2. There's an awful lot of similarity there. The skeleton models are the same. The brickwork in Mortal Online 2 and a couple of the dungeons are the same as Ironmace's game. It's likely that they just chose the highest quality asset packs, and those were the ones that got bought. If the list is really short, it's not that hard to overlap them, but giving them the benefit of the doubt is one thing. The arrangement is the other. The question is whether or not that arrangement is enough of a similar thing for the court to side with Nexon or side with Ironmace. And then the question is also if Joo-Hoon Choi were working on this project and was able to retain an awful lot of knowledge about what it was that he had been working on, and maybe the door was 1.4x in scale or whatever. That being what it is, if they just made a similar scaled game with similarly named things like torch.u asset or fireball.u asset and ended up having to use or happen to use the same color of torch, maybe because the torch's fire by default was the same yellow color that was in Project P3, we don't really know. But it's plausible, at the very least, to say that the people that work at Ironmace just kind of remembered certain key factors of what it was that they had been working on in P3. The legality of that is whether or not it's legal. We don't know. We don't know what the court's going to say. What I can tell you, though, is in the history of IP, when it comes to software and software development and copyright and patent infringement and copyright infringement, usually when software is iterated on to the point where something looks built upon, right? Like you have a house made of Legos in the center, and you build this larger mansion-esque house around the smaller house. Is the smaller house owed something? I don't know. Historically in the United States, the courts have more or less said no. That's not how it works. But I don't know what Korea is going to say, and I don't know where they're going to fall on this whole case. I think that there is definitely pieces to this, without a doubt, that you could say that Ironmace formulated of their own volition. The game is too far along now to say that it is reminiscent of possibly of Project P3 is one thing. To say that it's using Project P3 and then building around it is another. It's a very different game now, especially considering what P3 was. So we don't really know. Anyway, guys, that's what I have for this one. Thanks so much for coming and checking it out. My name again is Onepeg. If you wouldn't mind subbing the channel here, that would be amazing. Otherwise, you can come check me out over at twitch.tv/Onepeg. And I suppose I will see you in the next one. Thanks so much for lending me your eyeballs, everybody. See you real soon. Peace.